Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Recovery Bank Community Education Series. My name is Frank Bollock. I'm the project manager here at the Recovery Bank. And we have been offering this education series the last several months in an effort to provide information regarding various aspects of substance abuse disorder, alcoholism, related topics. For those of you that don't know, the Recovery Bank is a community recovery resource center. We are located at 120 Wyoming Avenue in Scranton. Our principal mission is to connect people who are seeking recovery or looking to initiate recovery, connect them with people who have experienced some success in recovery. We also look to connect people with recovery resources, and part of that, of course, is to provide information to individuals in recovery and the community in general. So tonight we have a presentation on alcoholism, substance abuse disorder, and various strategies that family members might be able to use as part of an intervention strategy. Our presenter tonight is a gentleman who's been involved in the recovery treatment field for many years, personal friend of mine, a member of the board of directors of the Treatment Court Advocacy Center, and a person who has a very impressive resume. I'm just going to read a couple of his qualifications. Vince Carolan, C-A-R-O-L-A-N. Vince is a counselor in private practice here in Lackawanna County. His offices are located at Clark's Green Corners, and his practice primarily focuses on services to individuals, couples, families, in individual and group settings. He conducts interventions for families and companies. He is a graduate of the Thomas Edison College in Trenton, New Jersey, received his Master of Arts degree from Farley Dickinson University. He is a trained interventionist, a certified addictions counselor by the Pennsylvania Certification Board, certified in co-occurring disorders by the Pennsylvania Certification Board, and as I mentioned, a trained and board-registered interventionist. He's been the clinical director at a number of treatment facilities. He was the executive director at Marworth for a number of years and the head clinician there for many years. A breadth of experience and knowledge in substance abuse disorder, and particularly with intervention. So he's going to discuss those topics tonight, and I know that you'll find this talk informative. I'll present Vincent Carolan.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's an honor. This Recovery Bank, since inception several years ago, has done a lot of good for a lot of recovering people. And from the looks of it, it looks like it's going to be hugely successful over the next number of years. So it's exciting to have the Recovery Bank and certainly to be a part of it. I do want to talk, as Frank said, I want to talk a little about substance abuse disorder, but it's so hard to say. I'm just going to say drugs or alcohol. I think everybody understands that. So substance abuse disorder is the clinical term, and if you were diagnosed with that, that's what your insurance company would be told, that you're being treated for substance use disorder, and then whatever the chemical was, they would add that. But I think for simplicity's sake, I'll just say drugs or alcohol or chemicals. The substance abuse disorder, or it's been called many things: alcoholism, drug dependency, chemical dependency. So it's all the same thing. To me, I say drugs, alcohol, or other drugs, since I think alcohol is a drug. And so that's why I'll do it tonight. It'll be, it's a substance use disorder, but I'll just call it drugs or alcohol or both. So when we're talking about substance use disorder, alcoholism, drug dependency, The dependency on the drugs or alcohol can be psychological or physical or both. We definitely need to detoxify people who have been using substances for a period of time and using them in a way that they became dependent. We do. Physical dependency, of course, needs a safe medical detox in an inpatient environment. And you need doctors, physicians who have some experience with addiction. You know, if you detox someone from alcohol or from opiates or opioids or marijuana, cocaine, the painkillers, oxycodone, hydrocodone, you need different detox medications, different protocols, and they also require different lengths of time. So you must be safely medically detoxed if you have one of these dependencies, because certain drugs, certain chemicals, like alcohol or like benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are things like Xanax and Klonopin and Ativan, Halcyon. Those are benzos, and you can have a seizure if you abruptly cease using those after using them for quite a while. So anything like that. Alcohol is another one. Alcohol, you need a safe medical detox if you've been using it regularly for a period of time. A 5 or 6 day detox to make sure you don't have a seizure. And I could add that everyone who just abruptly stops alcohol or benzos, not everyone is going to have a seizure, but many will, and we don't know which ones they are, so we definitely recommend that they get into an inpatient detoxification center, which are usually found in rehabilitation centers. And rehabilitation centers, we have a number of good ones locally, and some are short-term, some are just detoxification centers. They might keep you 10 or 12 days. Some chemicals you might have to be detoxed over 16, 18 days, like some of the benzodiazepines for high-dose long-term users. So the detox for each of the medicines, each of the drugs, you're going to find a different time frame and different medications. But once you're detoxed, once the drugs are out of your system, the recovery is pretty much the same. Everybody who is involved, anybody who has become dependent on drugs or alcohol or both, they have to admit that they're powerless. They have to admit that they cannot control their drug or alcohol use, and that they are going to abstain from further use. So when you talk about rehabilitation, your rehabilitation to me means you're going to restore someone to something they once had, something like their values, traditions, relationships, ways of doing things. So you can rehabilitate a person if they have had those advantages, like traditions in the family, values, and good relationships. There are also cases which are known as primary rehabilitation cases. And they're known as that because you can't restore them to something they never had. So some people just didn't have the advantage of a solid family life, and they weren't taught some of the traditions and values and things that many of us have learned. So those people, they would require a longer term rehab stay, probably along the lines of 8 or 10 months. So they can basically be built up and learn something that they never learned before. We consider chemical dependency, alcoholism, drug dependency, we consider this particular disease entity to be progressive, chronic, and often fatal. Progressive meaning that it gets worse over time. You continue to use these substances, then you will experience more consequences, physical, legal, emotional, marital, because it is progressive. It doesn't stay at one level. Chronic meaning forever. You're not going to be an ex-substance user. You're not going to be an ex-alcoholic. So If a person is 40 years old when they recover, then they're not drinking anymore for 50 years, then they'll be a 90-year-old recovering alcoholic, but not an ex-alcoholic or drug addict. So the substance abuser has to not only stop using chemicals, but they have to learn to live comfortably in their skin without the use of chemicals or alcohol or other chemicals. But they don't know how to do that. They have used substances to get through life situations, life's travails, whatever happened in their lives. They tended to go to alcohol or drugs to get through. And that's what they've learned. They have learned that when things are rough, when I feel sad, when I feel depressed, when I feel angry, when I feel celebratory, when I feel these things, I can take a drink or smoke a joint or snort a pill, and then any of these negatives go away. And so what happens to them when they stop drinking, stop using drugs? How are they going to learn to live? They never learn, especially when you're dealing with people who started their substance use back in their teens or even before. We see a number of people started before teens, but mostly teens and late teens, and they haven't really learned how to cope with life, how to deal with social situations. Whatever, fears of rejection, fears of abandonment, fears of being thought stupid or not equal. These fears live with people. They do have them. They haven't had to deal with them or work through them as long as they could use chemicals. But now in recovery, these folks have to learn how to live comfortably in their skin without going to these substances. And that process begins in rehab, in the rehabilitation centers. And then it carries forward when they leave there. They should get into recovery programs like AA programs, like NA, and other non-12-step programs. But those are the places where you would learn how to live comfortably in your skin and how to deal with your feelings of vulnerability and feelings of hurt feelings and fears and insecurities. Insecurity about your body or insecurity about your adequacy in certain areas of life. So you have to basically stop using the chemical in a safe detox environment, and then you get into learning how do people live, how do people get on with life, how do they deal with situations without using substances. And a lot of people use the self-help programs because they are peopled by people who have had that experience. They know how to do this, so they take these newcomers on, and they help them into the steps or whatever recovery program that they're in. So stopping use of chemicals or alcohol or any drug is not recovery. Some people think it is. They say, well, if I stop using, I don't have the disease of addiction or chemical dependency. But they soon find that they really want to go back to using. Even if they stop on their own safely somehow, they don't have a seizure, nothing bad happens. But they find that they don't really feel comfortable in their skin. They get a little bit rigid. They kind of black and white thinkers, and my way or the highway. Their families find them hard to live with. I've seen family members over the years who, oddly enough, they wanted desperately for the person, their husband or wife who was using these chemicals, they wanted desperately for them to stop. But when they see how they behave when they stop, and if they don't get into recovery programs, one of them said, I think I'm going to buy them a six-pack because they were so hard to live with, because it was hard for them to live with themselves, because they didn't know how to live with themselves without the drugs. So often they'll go back to it, or they'll find their way into recovery programs. So stopping the use of chemicals just sets a floor. All that means is now you can recover. some people over the years, when they were drinking, using drugs, things have happened in their lives that they didn't deal very well with. And I've seen a lot of that where people have lost loved ones, parents, children, siblings, people close to them, and they maybe attended services for the person, but they really didn't. They didn't go through a grief process because they drank or used drugs, and they didn't have to. In their mind, they didn't have to. So when you have to, when you see what's happening when people stop the use, they'll start talking about the sadness they feel over losses that they've experienced and that they never were able to work through. And at this point in their lives, they're learning. They can, dealing with recovery people, dealing with the step work that they probably are going to do. They learn conflict resolution without violence. They learn how to make small talk in social settings, which often they don't know how to do because they drank through that as well. So anyway, I think that I'm trying to make it clear that recovery is a necessary component. You can't just stop using these substances and expect that you know how to live life like someone who never did use them. So vulnerabilities, people, if you love somebody, you're vulnerable. You could lose them. They could betray you. They could die on you. Often, we don't know, but anyway, if you love somebody, you are vulnerable 24/7. You can get a phone call any day, 24/7, that someone that you love is gone, or that they have left you, or anything could happen. And when those things happen, people will generally, when they were drinking and using drugs, they went right to the chemical, whatever they were using, and that's how they got through it. So feelings of vulnerability, when you stop using the chemicals, you have some real awareness of your vulnerability. And you've got to get comfortable with that, because if you don't, you're going to have to go back and use the things that made you comfortable. And those things work, but they'll take everything you have. So people who are not dealing well with their feelings of vulnerability, if they can't drink, which if they could, but if they've decided not to drink or use drugs, they have to find some way to escape from it, because they don't know how to deal with it. And what the escape is anger. So many people who feel extremely vulnerable to having terrible things happen, they can't drink anymore, so they use anger. They get into arguments, they get into conflicts, because the person who is angry feels the opposite of vulnerable. They feel powerful. Whether that's a wall-punching, plate-throwing rage, or just a quiet, seething anger, that person feels the opposite of vulnerable. And so they recognize that they need to learn to deal with these, because you can't drink at them or use drugs at them anymore. I also want to say that after detox, some drugs, and this is my experience now, some drugs seem to require a longer, they require a longer time in rehab or halfway house setting, some kind of a structured living environment, because you can't, and at this point I'm talking about people who use opioids or opiates. It just seems to me that they have extremely powerful cravings, and I'm not saying that people who use other chemicals don't have cravings. They have very strong cravings. Alcohol, people, pills, marijuana, everybody has strong cravings when they have to stop. But I think the opiate and opioid users, they experience something a little different. So I think what I've seen over the years is that they need longer terms in recovery, longer terms in rehab. So the 3 or 4 week rehab is really not adequate for most. And that's why we see so many opiate and opioid users in relapse very shortly after treatment. So there is one exception. I think if they can use Vivitrol, which is usually offered by the treatment center if they're treating a heroin addict, oxycodone, a hydrocodone person, before they leave, they would say, we'd like you to be on Vivitrol, which means Vivitrol is injectable naltrexone. And you can inject it once a month. And what it does is it blocks the opiate receptors in our brain. So that if you leave rehab after 3 or 4 weeks and you have some strong cravings and you slip up and you shoot heroin or snort pills, you won't get high, because the Vivitrol or naltrexone has blocked the receptors for opioids. And treatment centers recommend that the people get that injection once a month for a year. And I think that's the better way to deal with people who have had the opiate experience to that extent. Vivitrol is also believed to diminish the cravings, the power and the frequency of cravings in people who have alcohol use disorder. So it doesn't block the receptor, but they do have diminished cravings, and I've seen successful cases using that. So when we're talking about Vivitrol and naltrexone, we could also put in there buprenorphine, or what's the brand name is Suboxone, or Subutex. Suboxone is an opioid itself, but one does not develop a tolerance to it. So you can use, let's say, if you're a heroin dependent person, and if you stopped using heroin, you would go into a horrendous opiate withdrawal. And people just fear that, and they will not do that willingly. So you can put that person on a daily dose of buprenorphine. But basically, you're not putting them on buprenorphine alone in most cases. We want them to be on Suboxone, because Suboxone is buprenorphine. It will stop the people from going into withdrawal if they stop using the opiates. But you don't develop a tolerance to it. And Suboxone has in the medicine with the buprenorphine, it's a combination of medicine, they have naltrexone in there. So you're using the naltrexone with the buprenorphine in that one medicine called Suboxone. And so there again, you have the naltrexone in your system. It's not injected. It's basically sublingual or under the tongue. That's how they use Suboxone, or in a pill base. But anyway, that's something that would be strongly recommended. Naltrexone blocks the receptors for opiates and opioids, and there is an exception, fentanyl. Fentanyl has a tendency in some amount or some quantity to break through that. So it's not 100% fail-safe, but it certainly is better than anything we've seen. So that's something now we have a term, medication-assisted recovery, or medication-assisted treatment. And so buprenorphine, Suboxone, Vivitrol, they come under the heading. Also something like a drug called acompressone, which is something that you give to alcohol-dependent people to diminish cravings, and that's also medication-assisted recovery. But also, you may have a person with a comorbid mental disorder. They may have a dependency on drugs or alcohol, but they may also have a major depressive disorder. They may have bipolar disorder. They may have any number of mental disorders. So those people, that needs to be identified in the treatment centers. Hopefully they're in a treatment center so they can get diagnosed. They try to get diagnosed while they're using the substances. They'll go to a doctor or psychiatrist, and they'll try to, the psychiatrist or doctor will try to give them a medication for the diagnosis, but it's kind of not sure what the diagnosis really is until you can get the alcohol and other drugs out of the person's system. So you have to be careful of that. If you have a comorbid mental disorder, you're not likely to be successful in recovery, because you probably have been self-medicating that mental disorder for a long time. And when that's taken from you, or when you decide to give it up, your mental disorder is going to make itself known, and you'll have to be diagnosed and treated for that with medication most times. So basically, it's a matter of stopping the use safely, learning how to live comfortably in your skin without the substance, and it's a lifelong process. Funny thing, the early, I guess the first 12-step program would be the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the old timers, the people who founded that program and the early members of that program, they watched, they recruited other members. They went to hospitals and detox units back in the 30s and 40s, and they helped people get into the fellowship of AA. And what they saw was people seemed to be not really mature. Not, let's say, the men and there were mostly men at that time that they brought into AA. They may have been in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and most were, but they seem not to have the emotional maturity of a person in that age group. And so these AA founders and early members, they came up with a term, which was certainly not a clinical one. They said, it looks like, these people, they're coming to meetings and they're learning to live without alcohol, but they seem to react to situations like teenagers almost. And so they came up with an idea, their saying was, well, it takes about 5 years to get your brains out of hock. And so that's totally not clinical terminology, but I think what they were seeing was emotional immaturity. They were seeing people who started drinking and maybe using drugs, but mostly back then it was alcohol. And they were using those things to get through life, probably started in teens or 20s. And so the person who becomes dependent on alcohol, they don't learn from their experience. They're not really introspective. So it's almost like you could become 16 and start drinking pretty good back at that age, and then you could repeat that birthday 25 times, and now you're 40 or 41. And that's really what it seemed like to these guys, and that's why they said it takes you 5 years to get your brains out of hock. So that's something that we really have to watch when you have people who started early in life. They really didn't develop emotional maturity. They didn't go through the behaviors and the responses to life situations. If you're a teenage girl or boy, you're worried about asking the person to the prom or the movie, and you're anxious that they might reject you or say, no, I'd rather go with somebody else, and it would be devastating. So the normal person would go to their adult people, they go to their parents, they go to their counselors, their rabbis, their ministers, or whatever. They'd go to these adults and say, wow, I'm really having a hard time emotionally because I'm afraid that Susie or Joe won't go to the prom with me, and I have to, so I don't want to ask them because it'd be awful if they said no. And these adults help these young people to work through that. And they say, yeah, I've been there. That's happened to me earlier in life, and here's how I did it. So they teach these young people to feel the fear, the anxious feelings, and walk through it anyway. Do it. And you'll survive it. If they don't go with you, you'll find somebody else. So that's the way, that's a normal upbringing. That's what normal teenage kids, that's what they do. But the person who starts with the marijuana, the alcohol, and the pills, they don't do any of that. What they find is that when they feel anxious, they feel fear of rejection, they can, smoke a joint, have a few beers, or snort a pill, and they don't feel that fear anymore. And then they can go ask anyone in the world to anything. But what happened? That's a very powerful learning. So of course that's what they've learned, and that's what they continue to do in life until they get into recovery and they start to develop emotional maturity. And then they start to behave and respond to life situations like an adult would. So it takes them, I think in 12-step programs, you'll probably see 4, 5, 6 years of people just kind of growing. They may be 40 or 45 years old, but they'll react to emotional situations like a 15 or 16-year-old. And it's pretty common. People see that all the time in 12-step recovery. So I think that's enough on substance use. I know that you had Dr. R. Scott, you had John Knowles, you had Barbara Durkin. here in recent weeks, and they all presented some really great information. Barbara, she provided all of the phone numbers that the county, you can get treatment. Barbara said Lackawanna County, and I think Susquehanna County, she represents them too. They have funding. They can pay for treatment. If someone needs treatment and they don't have Blue Cross or Geyser Insurance or whatever, the county will fund it. They will pay for them. So there's no reason for a person who has substance use disorder, no reason for them to continue to suffer. They can get treatment, they can get help, and the county is behind them. So I want to talk now, why would a person like that, a person who is dependent on alcohol, drugs, and whatever, why would they want to stop? Why would they want to stop drinking or using drugs when they believe that it's helped them to get through life to the point wherever they are? And they do not, now their family members, their wives, their children, their husbands, their parents, they see the dysfunction in the dependent person. But the dependent person, even if they see it, it's only a blip on the screen. It doesn't have a lot of meaning, and it does not stop them from continuing in the active phase of addiction. They continue to use drugs and drink. So why would they want to stop? Now, I have done many interventions over the years, as Frank has said. And intervention, I think that the word sometimes seems to intimidate people. I just look at it as, look, you have a person that you care about, a person that you love, and they are in the grip of a death-dealing disease. And what are you going to do? You ask yourself, what would I do to alter the course? What would I do to help them save themselves? And often the answer is we will intervene in a disease process. We will step up and we will do for our loved one who's dependent. We will do for them what they can't do for themselves. So when I do an intervention, I generally get a call from one person, a wife, husband, parent, whatever. And I'll do a telephone assessment to see, is this some person who needs to be intervened on? Is this a person who, for all present, for what I can see and what the person on the phone is sharing with me, if I see, well, I think, yeah, this is a candidate. This person, we can intervene on them with some promise of success. So then I'll have the person who called me, I'll have them come into the office. And I'll have them, or if we do it in a hotel conference room or wherever. And I'll basically get an in-depth history of what's going on with this substance user. And then I would ask about people who might be willing to become members of an intervention team. And by that I mean the friends, the relatives, the children, whoever cares about this dependent person and is willing to step up and do an intervention, guided by a professional interventionist, and there are many of us, then we say, okay, there are friends, maybe an old college chum, maybe there's a clergy person that this person has some regard, some respect for, certainly the family members, even children. I generally think if a child is 12 years old or better, they probably can do okay in an intervention, when we finally do the intervention. And I say that because, the child should have some ability to help the parent who is being so hurtful to them. And basically, if they're given an opportunity to help mom or dad, let's say, in an intervention setting, they're very, very effective. If you have a 12 or 13-year-old young person in an intervention, they're very effective because mom and dad, they listen to that young person. So we decide on a team. We say, okay, here's 6, 8, 10 people, whatever it is, 12 sometimes. And I will spend an entire day with that group. I'll get the 6, 8, 10 people who are going to do the intervention with me, and I will spend a day with them, whether we do it in the office or a hotel conference room, and I provide an education about not only what's happening to the chemically dependent person, but how the family has been affected too. they generally know that they've been affected, they've been wounded, hurt, verbally, physically, emotionally, whatever it is, but they somehow don't really they don't really want to know about that. They don't want to talk about how they've been hurt. They basically want to help that person who's in the grip of the addiction, the disease. So sometimes people are angry. Sometimes people who live with a drug or alcohol dependent person, sometimes they're very angry with them. And sometimes they plan to heap that anger on the person when we do the intervention. And that's something that we have to head off. That is not something that we want to see in an intervention setting. When we do the intervention, when we intervene with this person, the room in which we do it is filled with love. It's filled with love and compassion, but also truth. And the person who, let's say, I spend a day, we educate the group that's going to do the intervention. I meet them 7, 8, 9 o'clock the next morning where the person is, where the dependent person is. And then we walk in, the person is totally surprised. And that really is the part, that's why this style of intervention is so successful, because the person has no idea that this intervention has been planned, has no idea what's going on. And we walk in and we say, we'd like you to listen. I tell the person, look, your family's done a lot of work. They're very concerned about you. And right now, all they're asking you to do is listen. And then the person will sit down. And then yesterday, the day that we provided all the education to the families, at the end of that day, all of these intervention team members have written a letter to the dependent person. And they've written a letter that is basically, I give them the outline. It's always their words, not mine. I give them the outline, and we have 3 different segments to that letter. And I let them know what the first segment should be, what kinds of thoughts and words should be in that. And then the second segment is more directly saying, well, look, I'm here today because I'm concerned about you. And then the third segment is where they'll if they decide that they don't want to go to treatment, they don't want to recover from their dependency, if they decide not to do that, then the family members have already made a decision that their life is going to change, that their relationship with their family or friends, whatever, is changed. They're not going to support this destructive lifestyle anymore. They're just not going to do it. And so sometimes people have to be very, very upfront. Tell them that if you decide you don't want the help that we're offering today, then we're going to have to reconsider whether we're going to stay married, or whether the children are going to stay here, or whether we're going to continue you as an employee of ours. There are so many things which sound somewhat coercive. I said I would guess that's a good word. They are coerced. They find out that they don't want to go to treatment, but they know their life will change in ways that they don't want their life to change, and therefore, generally they go. Very, very high percentage of people in a surprise intervention. This is called a Johnson Institute style of intervention. And the Johnson Institute in Minnesota was founded by a clergy person. He was an Episcopal priest. And his name was Vernon Johnson. And back in the 70s, he just said he was just sick and tired of his congregation members coming to him and saying that their husband or wife or father or mother, whoever, was addicted to drugs or alcohol, and all they were told by other people was, well, you have to wait till they hit bottom. That's a real dangerous tack to take, because bottom might mean death. Bottom might mean loss of job. It might mean loss of freedom. You may have to go to jail or prison because of things that you do when you're under the influence. So Vernon Johnson, this priest, he started to work with families and did just what I'm pointing out to you, or I'm describing to you, is that you find out all the history, find out what's going on with the person and how they've been behaving and what they do and such. And you let them know that you want them to get help. Before you sit down, before I would sit down with a person to do an intervention, the family and I have already decided on a treatment center to send them to. And the treatment center is expecting to have them admitted that day. Okay, so all of it is prearranged. We're not guessing at everything. So the treatment centers, they know that most people will go, so they have a reservation, and the person generally goes to treatment. But it's sometimes a struggle. I think they can become argumentative. They can become very defensive when the family says, "Well, you were drunk and you fell into the Christmas tree last week," and then, "Well, yeah, what about you? You threw a ball through the window," or whatever. They'll be defensive. They'll try to turn it on to someone in the intervention team. But the surprise intervention, because they're emotionally off balance, because they had no idea this was going to occur, they're very successful. And I think families are intimidated. Families, I would say they're afraid. Their thinking is like, after years of trying to get this person to stop behaving like this, to stop drinking, drugging, whatever they're doing, after years of that, the family members are pretty beaten down. So they don't even have a real hope that an intervention would work, because they've seen so much failure on their part. And but they didn't do it the way I described to you. They just did it by pleading, cajoling, manipulating, whatever they did, but it didn't work. They approached the addict, alcoholic, and appealed to that person's logic or rational system, rational thought process. But the person that they're dealing with is not rational. They're not logical. If you're talking to a chemically dependent person, and you tell them you want them to stop using those chemicals, they hear, "You're squeezing off my oxygen supply," because they cannot envision life without it. And that's part of AA's literature. They can't envision life without it. And here we have a team, 6 or 8 people, 10 people in the family and friends, who are pleading with them to go to a treatment center to learn how to live without drugs and alcohol. You know, interventionists, we know that we're dealing with people who don't want help and often don't think they need help. Or even the ones who know that they're out of control, or the ones who know that they need help, they don't want it anyway, because it's too daunting to think about living without it. And also, most people, let's say an opiate addict, a heroin addict, has probably had some experience with withdrawals, and they're terrified by it. So they have a fear that when they get to the treatment center, if they went like we're asking them to go, that they would go through some horrendous withdrawal. But that's not true. I mean, good rehabilitation and detox centers have very skilled physicians who can give a person a very comfortable detoxification process from heroin or from anything else. So that's one of the styles of intervention. There are a couple of others. One I'd like to go into tonight, and that's called the family meeting. The family meeting is quite different than the intervention style I just described, because that is an invitational model. The chemically dependent person, the substance use, the person who's dependent on substances, is invited to the family meeting. There's a process that we call a recovery message. We have someone calls me. They don't want to do the Johnson Institute style of intervention that I just talked to you about. They don't want to do that because they're afraid. They're intimidated, and mostly they're afraid that the person will leave them or that they won't like them. And if you can, it sounds trite, like they're afraid the person won't like them, but that's real. That's the family members are afraid that if they do an intervention, whether it's invitational or surprise, that the alcoholic or addict won't like them anymore, or that they'll be angry with them. And they'll do anything to avoid conflict. So the family meeting, somebody in the family, somebody will call me, and I'll get some information, basics, and then I'll ask them to come to the office or wherever we're going to meet. And I'll get a sense of who are the people involved, who are the, who's the dependent person, what is that person's life like, and what are the other people, what is their lives like. And then I'll say, okay, we need one person in this group to deliver a recovery message to the dependent person. We need somebody to approach the person who's using substances and say, look, we're all concerned about you. We're really worried about the behavior. We're worried about the drugs, worried about the driving while drinking, whatever it is. And so we've arranged to meet with a counselor over in Clark Summit, and we're going to spend from 10 o'clock or 2 or 3 o'clock, whatever it is. We're going to spend a half a day, talking about alcoholism or drug dependency, whatever it is. And we'd like you to be there. We'd like you to come to that meeting with us. But you have to understand that if you don't come, if you decide not to come, we're going to hold the meeting anyway. Now, the thought behind that is alcoholics, to some degree, have a controlling nature. They basically want to be around when people are talking about them. So if we say, we'd like you to come to this meeting, but we're going to hold the meeting whether you come or not, that's supposed to be the motivation to get them there, and sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But anyway, we hold a meeting. We have a discussion about what's going on in everybody's life, and I provide some education about addiction, drug dependency, or whatever. And then if the person is there, we try to encourage that person to go to a treatment center to address this illness. If the person is not there, then we designate a person at the family meeting to go to the dependent person again and say, hey, we had this meeting, we've learned a hell of a lot, we're really interested in what's going on, and we had this meeting, we spent hours over at the counselor's office, and we have a good idea what's happening to you, and we're going to have another meeting. We're going to, 2 weeks from now, 3, whatever it is, we're going to meet over at his office, and we're going to go further into this, and we really want you to be there. You are invited. And so, but understand that if you don't come, we're still having the meeting. So that's the family meeting. We get together, we talk about what's happening to them, what's happening to the substance user. And in the end, if the person doesn't show up at either of those meetings, we wind up doing a surprise Johnson Institute style of intervention anyway. But anyway, in those cases, you can say, well, we tried to get you to come to 2 meetings and you didn't, so now we're doing this. But nobody's given up on you. We basically feel, the family says, look, we feel like we've lost you and we're going to fight like hell to get you back. We're not giving up. We know what's happening to you. Whether you know it or not is almost irrelevant. We know what's happening. We're going to get you the help because we love you. And not only that, there's a selfish aspect. It is too painful for the loved ones to watch this person's demise. It's too painful to watch it. And so that's basically, the alcoholic or addict is generally very self-centered and very selfish. So their focus is themselves. They're really not interested in how other people are hurting or other people have whatever's going on with them. They think about themselves more than anything. There's an old saying in AA that there was a guy sitting in a corner, and somebody asked him what was going on, and he said, well, I'll tell you what, I may not be much, but I'm all I think about. And that's the alcoholic. So family members, there's a group called Al-Anon. And Al-Anon is a group devoted to helping the family members and friends of people with substance abuse issues. And they find, it's like anything else. If you go into a 12-step program, I think basically it works because you're around people who have the same affliction, the same disease you do. And you can share your stories, you learn from them, they learn from you. That's self-help. I think at the recovery bank, there are recovery specialists. And I think that what that reminds me of is the early days of AA, when one alcoholic would help another one, because there were no Betty Ford centers, there were no Marworths or Clearbrook, right? So this is with the recovery specialists, the state has certified recovery specialists, and we have some here at the recovery bank. And I think that's back to basics. That's one alcoholic or one substance abuser helping another. That's exactly what it is. That's the early days of recovery. So family members really are encouraged to contact treatment centers, they know that the family has suffered, they've suffered grave damages, and they've suffered a lot of pain, they've suffered a lot of disappointment. They've been promised that the person's going to stop, and then the person stops for a couple of weeks or months, and then they go back to it. Why? Because it goes back to what I said earlier tonight, that they don't know how to live without it. So if they don't get into some recovery program, they're very likely to go back and do it again. Anyway, I basically, I'm really happy to have had this time to share some of the things I've learned over the years with the Facebook audience, the people here. And if you have questions, if anything I said causes you to have a question or you want to know more about something, please contact the Recovery Bank, and they will make sure that I get the information. If you have a question, they'll make sure I get it, and I will respond to it. Thank you, and good night.